for us a somewhat different way of approaching this. I think what we usually do is read the first sentence, don't we? And just start from there. But I did something that I've done rather frequently just in the last year, which I never used to do. I think it probably shows up on these tapes, and I wanted to say as a kind of footnote that it's quite unusual for us to do that. We never did it. But I have been sinning against our own rules by reading introductions. I don't know why I've been doing that. As I say, I think it's in a way wrong to do it because it takes you away from what Caesar himself wrote. You ought to begin Gallia est omnis divisa in partes tres, one of the most famous phrases in the history of the world. That's the beginning of the Gallic Wars of Caesar. But I peeked here just a few moments ago as we were sitting talking about something else, and I was leafing through this particular edition, and there's a little scholarly introduction, but the man does say something good. I guess over the years I got to hate, well, we both did, we just got to hate academics and to dismiss them all as fools. We were so opposed to that academic process, but you mellow a little bit, I guess, when you get out of it, as I've been out of it for several years now. I'm not so angry anymore as I used to be. And sure enough, every once in a while, one of these fellows says something very good. Anyway, he uses a word. He says, if you want to sum up the whole of Julius Caesar, it occurs in one word. Now, I bet he didn't make that up. It's too good. See? I bet someone like Gibbon did, or some famous writer. But anyway, he says it. This particular editor says it. The word is celerity, celeritas. That word occurs in our word accelerate. That is, it has to do with swiftness. And he says that Caesar had this quality. And that's good. I never thought of that before.
Well,
I guess we've talked about it, but that one word.
I hate to contradict you.
Oh, we did? Okay.
Because we very frequently did talk about that. You've forgotten as I forget so much, that was one of those qualities that we used to talk about.
We thought of it ourselves.
We thought of it ourselves. Yeah, maybe he got it from us.
Well, I suppose it's so obvious. It's like saying, gee, the sky is blue. And who first thought of that?
Yeah, I don't know which one of us first said it. Probably you did. Yeah. But
isn't that true? Of everything, though, not only his swiftness in battle, I think we did talk about his forced marches.
Yes, that was the main thing.
His ability to beat the enemy by getting there first. And that's certainly preeminently true of his military strategy, but it's true of his writing. It's swift. He gets right to the point. Look at that beginning. None of this fooling around, such as I've been doing for the last 5 minutes.
No introduction.
No introduction.
There's no introduction.
No preliminaries. He gets straight to the point, and what a swift, celerious, is there such a word? Accelerated man he is in everything he does. In his friendships, in his decisions.
Decisions. That's what I was going to say. Yeah, they're.
The most complicated question would be presented to him involving the whole of Roman history. Should I cross the Rubicon or not? He crosses it. He doesn't agonize for days. He doesn't reflect on it, and he's not a meditative man. He's absolutely the opposite of Virgil.
Yes.
He's not reflective. He's a man of almost pure action, and that celeritas is in everything that he is. It's even in his picture. There are several striking life portraits. The Romans were famous for their almost photographic art. Unlike the Greeks, they weren't particularly artistic. They wanted literal realism, and this is just a bust of Caesar at the front of the book that I happen to have here. And there it is. There's that celerity in his face. Nothing wasted. He has a spare look about him. There's nothing expansive. It's a lot of people would say determined, but I think that might be misleading. I'm not so sure. That gives the impression of a kind of stubbornness. He wasn't stubborn at all. He's flexible.
Oh, yes.
I think rather when you look at that picture, what you see is swiftness. It's in his eye. It's in the expression on his face. It was in his friendships. Everything about him. There's a lovely little poem I was reading a few weeks ago, modern poem of John Crowe Ransom on the death of a little girl. You remember John Whiteside's daughter? Mm-hmm. And it begins, there was such speed in her little body. It's just a wonderful line. Little girls, some of them will have that speed in their little bodies. Gee, I think that's a good line. And there's such a speed in Caesar's body as well as his soul. His anima, his soul is animated in every way. He is a man who is thoroughly alive in every sinew, both of his thought and of his body.
Mr. Senior mentioned the forced march, which is one of the things, the most obvious thing you could refer to as the product of this celerity of body and mind in Caesar, and you ought to notice that. I mean, it isn't something that necessarily you will notice for yourself. You have to read, as you read through this book, you will come across examples of it. He invented it. This was. He's also, we say, a very surprising man. That celerity produces surprise. You meet people every once in a while who have that ability to surprise you. They don't do what you expect them to do. And they do it so swiftly. It isn't as if it's planned. They do it with a great deal of spontaneity. And this was one of the great. This is one of the things that made Caesar simply a great general. And we give the example of the forced march. That is, that the phrase probably isn't that isn't his phrase. That's the modern phrase. What it means is that you instead of marching for one day, you march for 3 days or 4 days. Instead of the conventional way of doing it is, well, if you want to get someplace and you have to go by foot, as the infantry does and always has, you march all day, and everybody knows how much time you can make in a day.
It isn't all that much. 30 miles a day is about it for a large army.
And Caesar would
he went 60.
He'd go 60 or more. Mm-hmm. He'd say, "Well, I'm going on ahead to take care of the advanced preparations, and I'll meet you 30 miles up the road." Well, you'd get 30 miles up the road, and you'd look around. You'd say, "Well, where's Caesar?" And they'd say, "Well, he's 30 miles further on up the road. If you want to meet him, you have to go 30 more miles." So they'd say, "Well, here we go." And they'd march on for the rest of the day. And it meant, of course, that they would arrive at their destination much earlier than was expected. He got there ahead of time. The old Civil War journal, getting there fustest with the mostest. Who was that?
I don't remember.
One of those Southern generals, great Southern general. Well, he learned that, of course, from Caesar. Getting there first with the most, he said. That's the secret. That's the whole secret. Get there first, and Caesar always got there first. That whole quality in him of a kind of freshness of vision is just remarkable.
He disarmed people too in his personal life, the same way. That is, he surprised them.
Yeah.
He built up a certain reputation, and I'm afraid he still has it. Imperious Caesar, and as a high and mighty potentate, and he would completely surprise someone who was prepared to meet him by acting, swiftly. He's the kind of a fellow who would get up and come to meet you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he wouldn't wait for you to come to him. He'd come out and meet you.
There was none of the Xerxes.
Sitting on the mountaintop, not at all.
He was not a Persian despot at all, and I'm afraid the Hollywood impression that we have today of Caesar is of an Oriental potentate. When you read the book, you'll see right away that he's not that way at all. He has qualities of frankness, a good temper, a sense of humor, a kind of geniality. He was the kind of a person that people liked. And they weren't prepared for that. I think, having heard about him, they feared him and thought of him as a ruthless conqueror, and they were completely disarmed when they met him. Even people who knew him very well were surprised by him, like Cicero. There's that famous story of Cicero, who had supported Caesar's enemy, Pompey, and after Pompey's defeat, Cicero retreated to his villa, prepared to die. The Roman way was usually to commit suicide. That is, when your party lost and everything was through, you would retire in what they thought of as a civilized way, simply do away with yourself.
Well, either that or you faced death, certain death from your enemy, because he wasn't going to allow you to go on living. Anyway, the best thing to do is take your own life rather than to die ignominiously by execution.
So he waited for Caesar to come to get him, and he either would have killed himself or met his death with resignation, and he was just completely bowled over. Caesar appeared at his villa unexpectedly, and
personally knocked on the door. He didn't send emissaries say Caesar is coming to see you. He just went and knocked on his door.
And they talked about philosophy. He said, "I understand you've been writing some books on philosophy. Gee, I wish I had had more time. I haven't studied that since college." And they sat down and they talked all night. And Cicero never got over it. He had to change his mind about Caesar, whom he had known for 20 years. But that surprised him.
He was Cicero. We'll talk about Cicero later on. We'll read some Cicero and talk about him. But Cicero was on the other side politically, very deeply on the other side. He was what we call a republican in the ancient Roman sense of that word. He didn't believe in one-man rule, and Caesar did. Caesar stands for a one-man rule, which we usually call dictatorship, and the word was used in those days, although it didn't have
monarchy.
Monarchy, yes, is another word. The word was used, though, and it didn't necessarily have all of the terrible implications it has in our day, but it did to Cicero. He thought that was completely wrong. But when it came to the one man, who is the greatest example of that kind of thinking, he had to admire Caesar. He had to admire him, and he did admire him. He always spoke very highly of Caesar, and Cicero was not a man to speak highly of people that he did not admire. He was not a flatterer. Cicero was a very honest man.
He wasn't a coward.
Wasn't a coward. No, he would not praise a man out of fear or out of wanting to get something from him. And
that famous oration on Caesar, some of the modern skeptical critics have sneered at it and said, well, he was totally in favor with the new party.
That just wasn't like
I don't
Caesar.
think anybody in his right mind believes that. Cicero was just struck with admiration for the way Caesar conducted himself, having won. That is, he did not destroy all his enemies. He abolished the killing of enemies. What did they call that? Proscription. He said, well, that's not, I've won. The thing to do now is to go on with the governance. And if Cicero is one of the best men we have, and the best administrators, we need him. We don't want to kill him. We need him.
He genuinely admired Cicero.
He admired Cicero. These qualities of Caesar, I think we do have to talk about them, because although they are really plain as can be on every page of the book, you have to have an eye to see them. And I'm afraid that the modern prejudice against Caesar is so strong.
Well, he doesn't talk about himself really at all. He never.
None of these things are talked about in the book.
Never. He never talks about the celerity of Caesar. No. It's just that he doesn't. In fact, by the way,
he doesn't defend himself about anything in this book.
No, it isn't a book of defense. Although some people, again, you can't help saying it. Some modern writers say, "Oh well, what it is really a defense of his behavior." There,
it's a set of rigged reports.
Yeah.
But again, these are modern prejudices written by people who are so opposed to the dictatorial principle of government, the monarchical principle of government, that they're ideologues. They have to find fault with everything Caesar
No,
did.
they're not as generous with Caesar as Cicero was. And Cicero was right there. He was on the scene, and you never had a more dedicated Republican than was Cicero. A man really who really was ready to die for his cause and expected to die for his cause, and ultimately did die for his cause. Cicero did, but he could not help admiring Caesar. I meant to say that, by the way, in addition to reading this book, The Conquest of Gaul, you really also must read Plutarch's life of Caesar. In fact, we'll ask you from now on to read some of those lives of Plutarch. He's another great. He wrote in Greek, but he's really a Roman, and belongs to this period, and you have to get a copy of the Life of Caesar by Plutarch and read it. These anecdotes that we're telling you are there. Another one that I was going to tell, that I was reminded of, which is along the same line as the one about Cicero, is his treatment of Brutus. Remember, of course, that he was assassinated by Brutus. Brutus was the moving force of the assassination of Caesar, as is made very plain in Shakespeare's account of the death of Caesar in his play. It affects your understanding of that whole business of the assassination very deeply, to know of Brutus's past relationship with Caesar. They had been friends, but Brutus also was on the other side politically, and he fought for Pompey. He was on Pompey's side, and with the defeat of Pompey, Cicero wasn't a soldier. Cicero didn't fight at all. He wasn't in the army, but he wasn't fighting actively. But Brutus was. Brutus was a general, and he was fighting for Pompey. And when Pompey was defeated and killed, Caesar gave immediate instructions to those who were searching for Brutus not to kill him, and they didn't. They brought him back. They found him. He was out hiding somewhere, and they brought him back. And Caesar forgave him, and he made him an important figure in his government, and he trusted him, and he even practically adopted him. He was going to be one of his heirs, as I remember, if I remember the story correctly. His treatment of Brutus was simply superlatively generous, and it was he who betrayed Caesar. When you remember the words ascribed to him, again, those the words of celerity, et tu brute.
He's famous for his swift words.
Those swift, short sentences of his. He's very famous for them. You realize how much is contained in that. You know, because Brutus was one of the last people to stab him, because Caesar fought off his assailants, although it was a whole crowd of people. They were all going to stab him. But he said, when Brutus stabbed him, he said, et tu brute, and then he fell. He said, well, if even you have turned against me, then there's no use fighting. And he died. He gave up.
That's the origin, isn't it, of the famous unkindest cut?
And then, well, that's
Shakespeare. Yeah.
That's Shakespeare. Shakespeare said, he puts it in the mouth of Mark Antony. He said, this was the unkindest cut.
And I suppose the word unkind, again, does have a
it's
a medieval meaning.
Yeah.
That is, it not only means nasty,
yeah.
But it also is unnatural. That is humankind,
yeah.
And even of the family.
No, he treated him as a son.
Yeah.
He treated Brutus, who was a somewhat younger man, he treated him as his own son.
You remember when Dante's journey into hell, at the very center of the lowest circle of hell, modern readers are frequently surprised to find Brutus down there with
Satan. Judas.
Yeah. But the reason was that he not only was an assassin, but that he assassinated a friend.
Yeah, well,
that he betrayed, as Judas betrayed Christ. That is, Judas was his friend, his son, his adopted son.
And he had already forgiven him once for being his opponent, and that he would turn against him. It's just appalling. It's really appalling.
Shakespeare treats Brutus so sympathetically.
Well,
really, at least that's the way it's played.
It's played that way. I must say,
Yeah.
I can't read it that way.
Yeah,
I don't know whether.
No, I suppose I shouldn't have said that. The modern directors usually interpret it that way.
They treat Caesar. Well, there was the famous production during World War II where Caesar was. All of Caesar's troops were put into Nazi uniforms, and they went goose stepping around the stage. It was a piece of war propaganda. And then Brutus, of course, became the great champion of liberty. And
There's really very little of that in Shakespeare himself.
No, really not. I really don't think that he.
Although it's true that it's more Brutus's play.
It is than Caesar's.
Yeah. I suppose maybe that's what I should have said. That is that. It's not that he's sympathetic, but that Caesar, after all, gets killed off rather early, and he doesn't play much of a role.
But still, the title is still the tragedy of Julius Caesar. It's not the tragedy of Brutus.
You're right.
And
but when I think of the play, I do think of now there is Brutus's suicide.
Yeah.
As sort of the denouement.
Yeah.
Of the
well, and it ends with the. Well, even Mark Antony is generous to Brutus. He makes a speech at the end, which is very famous. He said he was this he says was the noblest Roman of them all. Now he doesn't mean of all Romans. It's very clear. He means of the conspirators. He's all the conspirators. He said he was the noblest of them all. He's very careful. He doesn't.
He knows his grammar.
Yeah, he knows what he's saying. It's often misunderstood. Say that you're going to exalt. Brutus does have a kind of nobility about him. I don't mean to deny that. But Mark Antony isn't saying he was the noblest Roman who ever lived. He says, to the contrary, he says to himself, not to an audience. After the death of Caesar, he says of Caesar, this was the noblest man who ever lived in the tide of time.
That's Julius Caesar.
That's Julius Caesar.
Not Brutus.
Not Brutus. No, he says he says that of Julius Caesar immediately after the death of Julius Caesar.
Well, it's true, isn't it?
That's true.
How does that go?
He says, here lie the ruins of the noblest man who ever lived in the tide of times. That's a marvelous phrase. That has some of that. In fact, it has a lot of the qualities of Caesar in it, like the kindest cut, the unkindest cut.
Yes.
It's a Caesarian
nice use
phrase.
Of words. Yeah. Well, Caesarian is almost a pun, isn't it? Cut. But the words are ripped untimely from the womb. They are. But the noblest man who ever lived is what Mark Antony is saying in Shakespeare's play.
Yeah.
And I suppose we do have to say that. I remember we always used to say that in class, and insofar as students listened, and they used to in those days listen, it would shock them. It would surprise them at any rate for us to say that. That is, that Julius Caesar is the greatest man who ever lived. Now, of course, among religious people, we always say, well, what about the saints? But the thing about the saints is they were not great men. That's the whole point.
And they don't live in the tide of times either.
No, and they weren't. But I mean, greatness. Christ our Lord was not a great man. The whole point of this, he was a humble man. He was not. Even the word noble.
No, noble is not appropriate.
Is not appropriate. We're talking. I suppose we're talking in a secular order, and in the secular order, we would have to say Julius Caesar is the greatest man who ever lived. And suddenly a phrase like that just sweeps out over the whole tide of time. That is the whole of history. And what about that? Who else are you going to put up there? I mean, people are so skeptical of saying that at all, I think.
Yeah,
nobody's the greatest. Yeah, about anybody. But there it is. And it isn't really that he's, how does the phrase go? Prima inter pares. That is, there's nobody even close to him. He really stands preeminent among people who ever lived. That is, we've talked about a lot of great men. We've talked about Alexander the
Alexander.
Great? Well, not much, because we didn't cover him in any particular
We mentioned
great
him
book,
in
but we
passing.
mentioned him. But we talked a lot about greatness in Herodotus
And Cyrus, and
Cyrus
the Great. Again, you call them; they have that in their name.
Yeah, and they were great men. But they're not like Caesar. He really does stand alone, and there have been great men since. We have Charlemagne, we have Charles the Great, which is what his name means, and Alfred the Great.
Alfred the Great.
That is, we have had great men since, great military men, great political men, but they are all in the mold and even conscious imitators of Caesar. But they don't measure up to the paradigm, to the mold itself. So he still stands. I mean, we in America always pick George Washington, and he really was a great man. I think we touched on this before when we talked about greatness. For Americans, George Washington is the father of his country, and the more you learn about George Washington, the more you discover the truth of the cliche. He really was a great man, but no one would say that he was Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar invented Western civilization, and that he didn't just invent the United States. He saw with that celerity. He had that quick glance, not the gaze of the meditative or the contemplative. We talk about the meditative gaze. Caesar doesn't have that at all. He has that sharp, instantaneous glance where he just sees what's to be done and he does it. But what he saw when he crossed that Rubicon was the necessity of the Roman Empire. That Rome would merely go down as another Athens if these internecine, endless civil wars went on, as between Caesar and Pompey, and before Marius and all the others, and the revolts against the Republic, Catiline and so forth. That really was recapitulating the history of Athens versus Sparta.
And it's been recapitulated afterward many times. It was notorious in all of the Persian Empire. All of the empires of the past failed. This Herodotus is a chronicle of the failure of empire. One after the other, they fall. The Egyptian Empire falls, and the Babylonian Empire falls, and the Persian Empire falls, and very often precisely because of that internal weakness, internal destruction, fighting that takes place. And you see, when Caesar, I don't think we can take it for granted that people listening to us are aware of the history involved here. That is, when Caesar came back from these Gallic campaigns, he had an army, a loyal, battle-trained army. And everyone knew that, and they were very worried about Caesar because they knew that the situation in Rome was very delicate, very precarious, and that there were lots of enemies and they were poised. And he knew that if he crossed that river, that little stream called the Rubicon, that it meant that there would be a bloody and decisive civil war, one that would
the Senate
had
passed a rule against his doing.
Yeah,
passed a law against it, forbidding him to enter Rome
the city with his army.
Right. He himself could come to Rome and be given his due honors, but not with his army. And he decided to disobey the law.
Yeah. And that's when he said, that the die is cast.
Alia jacta est. There's another one of those three words.
Yeah, 3 words.
We all remember the Veni Vidi Vici one. That's another one.
There's another one.
I came, I saw, I conquered. He wrote telegrams. This telegraphic, but unlike most telegrams, very clear. Nothing garbled about them.
Oh, I remember the famous. I remember the telegram. It reminds me the telegram or the message of the guy in World War II who sank the Japanese submarine. He had read Caesar. That guy had read Caesar, and he composed the telegram that said, "Sighted sub sank sane." My gosh, he was going straight out of Caesar. Right. Straight out of Caesar. Nobody told him to do that. My gosh, he just went out and did it. He sank that submarine.
But say it isn't only the words; they're winged words. but it's the celerity of the of the deed,
Yeah.
and of the historical glance. That is, he looked back, he looked forward, and he saw instantly that there was a destiny here. If this were not done, the consequences would be disastrous, and if it were done, that something would be decided forever. And it was so. Now, of course, the historians have gone all over this and argued and cracked it all open again, and everything that we're saying has been shredded by our own contemporary historians. But we're following the 2,000 years of tradition about this. That is, the modern critical historian, the debunker, has gone after Julius Caesar. I don't suppose there's anybody more, except perhaps our Lord himself, the scriptures, that they've gone after.
No, the great historical figure, the figure of the secular world that is most considered the enemy number one, is Julius Caesar.
But it's because for 2,000 years, everyone has accepted what we've been saying. That is, that he is the greatest man who ever lived, and that he made a decision which created Western civilization. That is, we've talked about this so much. The Greeks are, everything about the Greek is something prior, preparation. There was a great preparation for something. You can see it in Homer. You can see it in Plato. Even in the diversion of the tragedy, you can see it in Herodotus and Thucydides. That is the Greek experience, as a very good modern historian called it. The Greek experience was a preparation for the Roman thing. The Roman thing, the res publica, the public thing, is not an experience. It's a fruition. It's a consequence. And in that sense, it's wrong to say that Western civilization begins with Greece. It begins with Greece in the sense of its background or of its origins.
Yeah, or of its principles. That is,
principles.
The Greeks saw the principles of things.
But they never did it.
They didn't do it. They didn't make a thing. Mr. Senior used the word thing, and that's an Anglo-Saxon word. The word thing. It's the Roman word is race.
R-E-S.
Race, and that's a great concept. I don't want to call it a concept. That makes it sound abstract.
No, it's concrete.
It's concrete, and the Romans. What you have a sense of especially when you read this book, is that Caesar has hold of things. He's a man who saw things as they are with a clear vision. He saw them at a glance, as Mr. Senior was saying. That he had a grip on things. You don't see that among the Greeks. The Greeks
are speculative.
They like to think about things. They like to speculate
and
debate about them. Caesar is a man, we said earlier, who makes decisions. That's what a military man is, essentially. That's where we get our idea of what a military man is. He's a man who is capable of making wise, practical decisions here and now, right this minute. Not an hour later, not a day later, not a year later, not after a lot of speeches. He might take counsel, but what he does is make decisions, and they're good decisions, based on the facts, based on the race, the things themselves.
I've been using a lot of ers, I feel, in this particular hour. I've been saying, because I haven't got that celerity with words. I have to reflect and grope, because there is a distinction, isn't there, between glibness and celerity. We're not talking about that gift of gab that the radio announcer has. There are some people who can just blab and are never at a loss for words. That's not Caesar. We're not talking about a man who was never at a loss for words. We're talking about a man who had an economy, but of words, and they were the right words. They were the perfect words. at the right time.
It's not just making rapid decisions, but it is making right decisions rapidly, I suppose you could say.
Yes. In fact, one of the things they say about Caesar is that he combined audacity with caution. There was a great deal of prudence in Caesar. Sometimes he did not attack. He retreated or he stayed home. He had a tremendous sense of caution. It's said of him that he risked his own life, but he never risked the lives of his troops. That he had a tremendous sense of the protective father of his soldiers, and would never wantonly risk them. He was not the kind of a guy who used his soldiers for cannon fodder in order to self-aggrandize. That's absolutely false about
no, or that he was hungry for battle or something of that sort. He avoided battle. He would much rather negotiate with the other side.
Most frequently did, as a matter of fact.
There was
battles had about them that economy. He chose them. They were just like the die is cast. That is, he only fought, let's say, 5 battles, but boy, were they the right ones. They were at the right place at the right time. They were the telling battles. He wasn't one of these guys who liked war.
No. The contrary. He didn't want to fight. He would.
I suppose General Custer did like war.
Yeah,
we have to say he really did. But Caesar's not like that.
No, you watch as you read the Gallic campaigns, and you'll see him again and again manage things in such a way that the enemy is put in such a bad position that they don't want to fight. They know they're going to lose. And of course, Caesar has a tremendous reputation, which he deserves. They know he is one of the greatest field commanders who ever lived. And there he is, Caesar himself, with these very adept and very skilled Roman legions, very, very courageous Roman legions. And he always tries to put the enemy in such a position they know they can't win. And so then he sends out emissaries and says, surrender. And he says, if you surrender, we're not going to punish you. We're not going to kill people. If you surrender, that's all we want is peace. And if you will be pacified, then we will leave you about your business.
And he did. He did something so extraordinary in Gaul. Now, in this book, we're going to read about the conquest of Gaul, but we don't learn much about what happened subsequently. What happened subsequently is that Gaul came into the Roman Empire and was at peace ever after. The people of France, of what was called Gaul, those wild tribes, could see with their own eyes that it was better to live under Caesar than to live under themselves. Because he made that perfectly clear to them. Their agriculture flourished. Their villages grew. Their sons lived. Their daughters.
Their property, their homes were
stability,
safe.
And safety. That is, France became the greatest nation in Europe within 500 years, and it was because of that Roman thing, and anybody could see that. As we look at the modern attempts to recapitulate the Roman Empire, the greatest, most recent attempt, of course, was the British. And the British did a tremendous thing. There's no question about it. There was such a thing. It lasted right up until World War II. There was such a thing as the British Empire. It flourished. It reached its apogee in the 19th century. And
the reign of Queen Victoria.
And you could say, all right, there was a great empire, and it was in many ways modeled on the Roman. But we have to add right away, there were certain differences. The British never brought their conquered lands into the Commonwealth of England. Well, except when it was too late. That is, after Mahatma Gandhi, after the 100 years of hatred on the part of the Indian people, then the magnanimous gesture, well, we will make you a part of the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth. But it was too late. The Indians wanted no part of it. That is, the Indians of India. The only ones who came into the Commonwealth were British colonies like Canada. But the conquered people would have none of it. And as we know, Africa would have none of it. To the point of Africa, as we see it today, self-destructing That is, I think anybody would say Africa was better off under the British than Africa is under itself. But the Africans don't care. That is, they hate the British so much.
And the Dutch. The Dutch was another great empire. I mean, really, it's hard for us to imagine the Dutch as a great empire, but they were. And they had those
Southeast Asia.
Yes, and their foothold in Africa too was a very great thing. But they didn't follow the example of Caesar at all. Quite the contrary. They were determined and are still determined. In that case, to
they want to rule
a conquered people, and Caesar never had that idea. He
created provinces, Roman provinces.
That's what southern France is called Provence. Often you don't think of that. It's still called Provence because that was the province. It was even called that, I think, before Caesar.
Yes, that was
the Roman. Right. And the trouble was, of course, that the province was constantly under attack, military attack, raids by the peoples of the middle and northern parts of France and Germany, especially of France. These half wild tribes of marauding outlaws, really, would conduct raids on the province, and even in Rome itself. They had sacked Rome twice. During the previous 50 or 60 years. I mean, they had gone right down into Rome, into the streets of Rome, and had burned and pillaged and murdered people in the streets of Rome. You have to understand, this isn't the book that we advise you to get that's available is the Penguin Classics edition and translation. The translation is unfortunate. The title, however, they call it The Conquest of Gaul, and that's not, of course, the actual title is the Commentaries. It's Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic campaign. That's what it is, and it wasn't a war of conquest at all. In the sense in which we think of conquest.
No, nor in the sense of Alexander the Great,
no, not
or
at all.
The Persians.
Yeah, the conqueror, great conqueror. Not at all. This was a pacification of a wild and a wild. It wasn't a nation. The Gauls didn't constitute a nation at all. It was
more
really
like American
tribal.
Indian tribes,
something like that. It was tribal. And there were, as you can see yourself as you read through it, there are these various tribes, and they are constantly setting off to destroy their neighbors and to burn their crops or to take their wealth. And Caesar, and that did impinge on the province, on the Roman province. And so Caesar once again decisively set out to put a stop to that. But how do you put a stop to a thing like that? By just conducting some punitive raids? That doesn't work. He realized that it was necessary to bring them into the Roman Empire.
The Roman Empire began to decline. And one of I'm moving now forward a couple hundred years. And one of the signs of the decline of Rome was the building of walls, such as the famous wall in England, across Hadrian's Wall, across the narrow part of the island where Scotland,
way up north
there, where the Firth. Is it the Firth, the Forth, or which Firth is it there? There's a big indentation of water there. It's the narrowest part of the single large British island, which includes Scotland, England, and Wales. And the idea that we will wall the barbarians out, Caesar didn't think that way. He wanted, if anything, to wall them in, but he didn't build walls. He rather brought people into the Roman thing. One of the reasons why I said so decisively here, that's a mixture of metaphor, isn't it? A decisive hesitation. I very decisively hesitated because I couldn't really find the right word, and I used civilization. I said that Caesar really founded Western civilization. And of course, we use that phrase, it's around all the time, but it's misleading. The reason I hesitated is that it's misleading. Some people have tried to come up with, since Christianity, a better word. They use the word Christendom. They use that word DOM for it. The Imperium,
the conquerors of the as well of the 16th century. That was it was
well,
largely
Spaniards,
16th century. The Spaniards,
all of them.
all.
That is, they did not really have the Roman idea. Well, here I use the word idea, and I have to scratch it. They didn't have the Roman thing, because it was not an idea. The thing about Caesar is he was not a man of ideas at all, nor a man of thought or reflection or contemplation. He was a man of action, and a man who dealt with things, concretely and particularly, so that if we do have to fall back on the word civilization, let's make sure that we understand that it was not civilization in the sense of a book that somebody wrote. When I said Caesar founded Western civilization, somebody's likely to think that he wrote a book containing the generative ideas of a great society or something like that. That's not what he did at all. This book here, The Gallic Wars, never mentions the word civilization. There's nothing. Caesar never thought about such things.
No, there are almost no ideas in this book at all.
But we who are men of ideas, looking back on it, we can see that what Caesar did can be understood in terms of ideas.
Yes, there are ideas that are behind it,
and in front of it, and that follow from it.
Yeah.
But the greatest thing about the Romans is that the Romans, as a people, were doers. I think we already said that. They operated in the political order, that is, in the legal order, their law. The things that they did, the things that they established, that they founded. You always think of the founding of Rome. I never heard of anybody talking about the founding of Greece. Greece was never founded.
No.
Nobody ever founded it.
No. No, you think of a foundation, really, when you think of Greece, Rome. You think of it as a foundation. Whereas what you think of, and you say, well, there's a Greek spirit. That's in other words. There's a Greek spirit. And that's true. There is. That's an approach. But really, people don't talk about a Roman spirit either. It's not. That's not appropriate.
Another word they use, ideals.
Oh, yeah.
It's very common for Greece.
Yes.
That is the Greek ideal, meaning an idea, but what, a high idea?
Yeah.
A
glorious
idea.
We talk about the sculpture of the Greeks as being idealized sculptures of those magnificent portrait sculptures of the gods. We say, well, they're idealized in the sense of being, to some extent, ideas of the gods, and that's true. They do have that element about.
Whereas Greek Roman sculpture is rather commonplace, rather more like photographs.
Yeah.
That is, if you want a picture of Caesar, there it is. But it's not a great statue. The art historians don't make all that much of Greek, of Roman art.
No, they consider it they consider it rather pedestrian, I suppose is the word they use.
Equestrian.
Yeah, equestrian or pedestrian.
A lot of them are on horses, but they're
not horses. Well, I think we said this before, that those Greek horses that you see on them,
they're gods.
They're gods.
They're gods.
Yeah, they're gods. They're all Pegasus, They're all mythological creatures, divine creatures. But you look at the horses, and they're magnificent.
But they're
strong, enormously strong horses that you see people like Caesar riding on, equestrian figures.
Yeah, they're not like race horses. They're more almost like percherons. They're big war horses.
Strong war horses is what they are, who can do work.
But they're not divine. They're real. They're I'm going to say they're human horses.
They're noble. They're noble creatures. They have a nobility about them.
And so does Caesar.
And so
that is, Caesar is a noble. He is a descendant, after all, of Aeneas himself. Yeah. He is Julius, and you remember Aeneas' son was called Iulus. He has two names, Ascanius, and sometimes he's called Iulus. And Julius, the name Julius, comes from Iulus.
It's of the Julian clan.
He claimed direct descent from Aeneas. Therefore, one of the noble Roman families, but not divine. There's nothing divine about Caesar. Nothing of the heroic. I think one might even say of the Romans that they were not heroes, in the sense that Achilles was, or Odysseus was. Julius Caesar is the greatest man who ever lived, and yet you're struck by how ordinary he is.
Oh, this book that you're reading is just it's just a report. It's a military report, is what it is. I think often students are a little taken aback by it, especially when they come from Virgil, or when they look back even to Herodotus. Herodotus is not a report. It's more like there's more. I mean, we said that the Romans invented romance, but there's romance even in Herodotus as compared to this. There's no romance in this book at all.
Well, there's no poetry
of any kind. No poetry.
I don't think there's a single metaphor. Maybe there's one. I suppose some scholar has found.
Well, there aren't any stories in here to speak of. There aren't any of those marvelous stories that you get in Herodotus that are just so striking and so marvelous.
Very little in the way of character sketch.
Yeah,
he doesn't tell you really what kind of a man Ariovistus was. We discover what kind of a man he was by what he did, by his action.
Yeah, we have to draw that out, though. It isn't given to us.
No.
This book is filled with rather remarkable people, but they don't seem remarkable to us except upon reflection.
I find myself mixing metaphors here, linking opposites. They're great people, but they're ordinary. They're not heroic. Well, what is that distinction? Well, I think it does go back to the divine. Isn't there something divine about Achilles?
Yeah. Well, you see, it's said he is. I mean, after all, he has a divine mother.
Yeah, exactly.
His mother is a god.
And so is Aeneas.
Yeah. And they all have descendants from the gods, and their behavior. It's very often said of them that they look like a god. That's said so often. They have intimate communion with the gods. Athena she talks to Odysseus, and Odysseus talks to her almost as if he is her equal very often. And that's
jokes
with
her.
He cracks jokes with her. He tells her lies, and she laughs at him. They're on the same level.
There isn't a single god mentioned in the Gallic Wars from one end to the other. If there is, now again, I'm sure somebody will find one, but it will be a commonplace calendar event.
Yeah.
That is, as we might say, well, you have to perform certain religious rites on a certain day, but there's nothing of the divine intervention here. Caesar mentions luck, good fortune, but he never mentions the intervention of the gods.
Oh,
now does he?
I keep thinking maybe he does, but it does have a kind of conventional sound about it.
I mean, he's a religious man.
Thanks be to the gods. We have been successful, but it isn't. I would say
he's a religious.
He's a religious man,
but he's an ordinary and conventionally religious man.
No, it isn't. It isn't that he's divinely inspired. I just read a life of Joan of Arc, and you read about her, and you just say, my gosh, she could never have done anything without the direct intervention of God.
That's the whole point. Joan of Arc was not a liberated Amazonian woman at all.
Not at all.
She was a frightened little girl.
Yes, and was remained frightened all through her life.
The whole point of Joan of Arc is precisely that she was a little girl, and that it was God who did it. And how wrong it is, some of the modern women have taken her up, well, by golly, we had our generals too, and they pound the table. Oh, no. That's not it at all. The whole thing is a miracle.
Yeah, it's just from beginning to end. It is. I know the book I was reading was one that said, and it wasn't hostile. This book was not. Most of it was transcripts from. It's quite a good book. Transcripts from the trial of the various trials of Joan of Arc, and it's really quite good. Really an interesting book. Very well done. But from time to time, and the author was not critical, not at all. He admires Joan, and he doesn't question her sanctity or anything of that sort, and doesn't raise any modern issues. But once in a while, he'll say things like, well, everyone's astonished that she could ride a horse, and she knew all about warfare. This is in the records. People, these old soldiers, they would say, how can this little girl work with a lance and ride a horse with full armor? This is astonishing. And he says, well, she learned that from riding horses around the farm. You just say, that's so ridiculous. It's like saying, well, really, Joe DiMaggio learned to play ball by hitting rocks with a stick.
Yeah.
You know, he did that, and then he came up to the big leagues and immediately began hitting home runs. You say, well, that's so silly. It was obviously a miracle, but Caesar is just an ordinary man. What he does, and he doesn't perform any miracles. What he achieves by intelligence, by determination, by this celerity of action, by courage, and very often he says by fortune, by good luck. And he does have good luck. That's a definite factor. And he doesn't necessarily attribute it to the gods. He says, well, by good fortune. It didn't rain that day, or it did rain that day, whatever it is. He's a man who has good fortune.
I think we touched on this before, but perhaps we could draw it out again, pick it up again, and put it on the table. There's a great deal to be said for miracles. God wrote a book of miracles. We can call it the Golden Ledger. It's the Legenda Aurea. It's the lives of the saints. And the Bible before it. But God wrote several other books too. And while they're not as obvious his work, they are still nonetheless his work. One of them is the book of nature. We've talked about that before. And the thing about nature is that it is not a miracle. When the sun rises in the morning, that is not a miracle. That is the way of the ordinary creation. And God wrote a book of history. This is the point I want to make. And it's a book of ordinary providence. And Caesar is part of that book that God wrote. That is in the tide of time. But God is the author of all the tides.
He lies outside the tide of times, but he wrote the book of the tide of times.
And I think today, perhaps above all, we need those of us, at any rate, who have touched on the supernatural, need above all a great return to this ordinary thing. I suppose this is a difficult subject, a delicate thing to talk about. You can divide the world into two types. There are those people for whom God just practically doesn't exist. If you ask them, they may even say that he does, and they may sincerely believe that, but they don't live as if he did.
They behave
as if he didn't. But then there are people, and we would call them religious people. And the temptation of the religious person is to think that everything's a miracle. That is, we forgive him for it, but it is a kind of superstition.
Well, he does it, of course, particularly as a kind of reaction to
against the other
guy who says, well, nothing happens. God doesn't have anything to do with anything. He says God doesn't have anything to do with the trees or the grass or the sky or anything of the sort. And the simple religious man says, no, the trees and the grass and the sky are miracles. Now, you say, wait, you don't have to say that. God is the author of nature. That's perfectly true. And the creation is itself a miracle, of course. To create something out of nothing, obviously, that is miraculous. But nature was made to operate by what are called natural causes, not supernatural causes at all.
But what a proof of God.
Yes.
What a proof of not only of his existence, but of his love. Of his providence.
Yes, exactly. It goes on by, it takes care of itself in a certain way. Not that it is not ruled by his providence. It is always under the rule of his providence.
I bring this up because I know a certain kind of student, a religious student, whom we love, who says, well, I'd rather read about Joan of Arc than Julius Caesar.
Yes.
Well, yeah, I would too. That is, it's
thrilling.
Thrilling,
It's
yeah.
thrilling. Yeah,
But I think I think that God will insist that we unwind a little bit and appreciate the ordinary. That is, in the whole course of history, the work of Julius Caesar is the work of God. That is, God's hand is on the ordinary, and we have to have a regard for that. In education, we really have to restore this way of comprehending the books of nature, which include the book of history. That is, there's the book of the natural sciences, and then there's the book of the human experience too, which God also wrote. See, he wrote the sun and the stars and the tides and the way they move, but he also wrote the affairs of men. He interferes in history, and he is the author of history, but he works through the ordinary,
he works through men.
Ordinary men. Yeah. Now he does every once in a while get exasperated and interfere totally, but that's always because of some terrible failure on the part of men. That is, in a way, when God works miracles, you can see him striking his brow and saying, "Do I have to do this again?"
Well, it's always what it always is a reminder.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that he's still interested in.
But it's because we've forgotten.
Yes.
It's the result of a fault. And you can say, "Oh, happy fault that led to this marvelous miracle." But the French king, the Dauphin, the Prince of France, was a lout, and he wasn't doing his job. That's why Joan of Arc had to come along and save the country, and he had to be brought back to his ordinary work,
his responsibilities as a man.
And so the enormous importance, I think, especially for religious people, to have a regard for Julius Caesar, a regard for this prose. It's not a mystical prose. I find the same thing among the religious people of a religious temperament. They look at this and they flip the pages and they say, "Well, it's not thrilling."
No, it's very ordinary.
Pick up a page of John of the Cross, Saint John of the Cross. Wow, it lifts you out of the seat of your pants and takes you up to the clouds. Julius Caesar brings you back down to earth again. This is the most ordinary prose that has ever been written. But let's have a regard for that, just as we should have regard for an ordinary day. Again, as we look out the window, this is an ordinary day. It's a quiet afternoon. It's not particularly anything. A little bit. It's not even splendidly beautiful. It's rather ordinary. The grass is green, and there's a few clouds in the sky. It's not one of those bright sky. We don't see Athena up there, particularly looking down at us at the moment. It's rather an ordinary day, and yet we have to say that God has given us this day, and God has given us this hour, and we should love this hour and appreciate this hour.
Well, I think too that even if you take Joan of Arc, you say, well, the fact is that vast, that most of her life was very ordinary.
Yes.
She had visions, she had voices, but when you look at the miraculous occurrences, well, they were achieved by men with swords in their hands. They weren't achieved by God stepping down and saying, "Well, now you don't need to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
I have taken over, and I now declare the winner to be the French."
Soldiers still had to do their duty.
They had to do their duty.
It was their ordinary duty.
Yes. They had to go out and fight, and the tide turned in their favor, and God did things for them. But He did things again through the agencies of nature. It turns out the miracles are not all that startling. She herself, Joan, is startling. But on the other hand, once again, you just say, well, she was the thing that's so startling is that she's just an ordinary little girl, uneducated and frightened and very much Not someone who is ethereal or working, you're mystical or working miracles all the time. She doesn't do any of those things at all.
Nothing spooky about her. No.
That's why so many people didn't believe her. They were bad-willed, of course, many of the people who didn't believe her, but they said, well, look, this is just this little peasant girl out of this little town, and she's a nice enough little girl, but for heaven's sake, she doesn't look like a saint to me, She doesn't look like the kind of person whom God would be talking to at all. She isn't St. Paul or St. Bernard or somebody like that.
I think as old professors of English, we not only know the religious type, but we know the English, certain kind of English major type who wants to be a poet or wants to be a creative writer anyway, wants to be somebody who writes some sort of spectacular language, and he looks at this and thinks he has nothing to learn from it. And again, we would like to preach this as a sermon to all of our hearers. Have a regard for the ordinary. What a wonderful thing it would be if you, whoever is listening, if you could write a letter, just a good letter. You're at school, or you're at a seminary, you're away from home. Have you ever written a letter home? Have you ever written to your mother? Written to your father? What about the ability to sit down and write a good, clear account of what you have been doing? Well, now Julius Caesar is the master. Now I'm going to say he's the greatest writer who ever lived. He's not only the greatest man. Certainly, his book, we've often said this, has been the textbook of Europe, the textbook of Western civilization. That is, school children, generation after generation, have been taken through the Gallic Wars, not so much because it teaches so much about how to act, that it gives you an idea of duty, which it does all those things. It's a book that operates on the moral level, but I think the chief reason is that it teaches people how to write. That is, if you could write a sentence like, all Gaul is divided into three parts. There's the part having to do with Belgium, and the part having to do with Aquitania, and the part having to do with the rest. What a simple way of looking at the map of Europe. I was about to use the word simplification, but it's not a simplification. No. It's that glance, it's that seeing how things are put together.
Cicero, among other things, praised the writing of Caesar, and of course that was Cicero's great province, was writing and speaking. As a public speaker, he was the greatest orator really who ever lived. Cicero certainly was the greatest orator who ever lived, the greatest public speaker, the greatest public man, almost you might say, in the sense of politics rather than of warfare. And yet he admired the writing of Caesar very, very greatly. He said of this book, he said, these commentaries are like nude statues, upright and beautiful, stripped of all ornament of style, as if they had removed a garment.
Sure.
That's
now Caesar would never write that.
He would never. That's not a Caesarian.
That's Cicero. See, that's filled with metaphor.
It's ornate. That's ornate. He's got a metaphor there, like nude statues. He says. Caesar doesn't write like that, but that's true.
Caesar would say, "Oh gosh."
Oh shucks.
But it's true.
But it's true. That is marvelous. That is marvelous. It's true. He says it's
but we marvel at Cicero, but of course Cicero is marveling at Caesar precisely because Caesar does not do that.
That's right. He's saying that there's a kind of astonishment in Cicero because he can't do that. Cicero cannot write like that. He can't be simple. And we say
Cicero couldn't write a letter home.
No.
As a matter of fact, we have his collected letters, and they're all orations.
Yeah, no, we'll read some of them, and they're documents.
They were meant for publication. They're obviously meant for publication.
Yeah, they're letters to his son at college. My heavens, on duty. They're long, for one thing. They're terribly long and very, very complex and ornate. Whereas the thing about Caesar is that he gets everything down. We say to the we often use the expression to the race. That's a kind of expression.
Okay.
Well, let's get down to the. People don't even say things. They use the Latin word. They say, well, now to the race. Let's get down. They mean by using that Latin word, they really mean let's get down to the bare. Uh,